Okay, welcome everyone to Australia versus the rest of the world, how OpenStack compares down under. So we'll just get our panelists, our fine panelists here to introduce themselves quickly, starting with yourself, Paul.
Hi, so I'm Paul Coddington. I'm a Deputy Director at Nectar and I'm responsible for the National Research Cloud.
I'm Roland Chan from Aptera. I'm not wearing my spacesuit at the moment, but perhaps later, if you come by the booth. I'm the COO of Aptera, so I do a whole bunch of hand-waving and sales talk.
David Hannes from Telstra. I'm an architect at Telstra and one of the chief architects for one of the SDN NFV projects.
And I'm Peter Lees. I'm Chief Technologist for SUSE in Asia Pacific.
So Peter Lees, we'll start with a question to yourself. The Amazon effect on open source cloud business models. Discuss.
Okay, so I'm interpreting this question as what does the overwhelming effect of large public cloud players like Amazon mean for OpenStack deployments, especially private cloud deployments. And from SUSE's point of view, I mean, our target audience for our products is really the smaller end of the scale. So Amazon and Google and Microsoft and so on, they're offering a very large product. They're offering a particular kind of product set. But people still have a need to have their own internal operational environment. And really, if you think about cloud, not just as a technology, but as a mindset, an operational mindset, if we're moving towards cloud as an operational mindset, then you need to not only be able to do that, implement that in the public sphere, but also in your own environment as well. And OpenStack lets you take a lot of the lessons that you've learned in that public sphere and move it inside your own environment too. There's also a need for more boutique cloud service providers, and we found a lot of our customers are in this space. So they're providing a more tuned, more tailored service to their end customers than say Amazon or Google or others do. So there's definitely a place for all of it. And as we know, open source is where most of the innovation happens these days. So I think OpenStack is a great playground for that as well.
Yeah. So are there any economic selling points for open source cloud? So if you go to a customer and say, well, you could use Amazon or you could use Google or you could use Microsoft and you could use us.
Yep.
And if we were to use us, it would be cheaper.
Well, there's two aspects to it, right? So the first aspect is what we see here at this event. You know, there are dozens and dozens of IT organizations out there all working and collaborating on OpenStack. You know, it's the open source effect is that you get innovation from all aspects of the community, not just from one aspect. And so, you know, you've got a larger range of ideas. You know, we work with our competitors as well as our partners to get the best technology up there in front of the end users, right? So there's that advantage, you get advantage of that. From an economic point of view, then, you know, especially here in Australia, we know that networking is not free, right? It's not even necessarily cheap. And if you're looking to have closer access to between, say, your data and your compute and things like that, there are some specific use cases where it makes more sense to have things, you know, within a small defined area on site. And so OpenStack is one way of giving you that option. It really depends on the use case in many cases.
Very good. All right, so let me put it over to the other panel members. Anyone got any thoughts?
Anyone disagree?
I'm not sensing any violent disagreement.
No, I don't think you would find a lot of disagreement. A lot of the points that Peter's hit on about working collaboratively with your competitors to get a decent end solution out the door is very much part of what I think we're all doing here. So yeah, totally agree with that. But yeah, the rest of it is, I don't know. I don't want to say motherhood because that would be rude, but yeah, I'm pretty sure we all agree with that.
So let me put the question to the floor then. So what are people's sort of perceptions around how OpenStack is relevant in a world with AWS and Google and Microsoft? What do people see as the advantages? Any comments or any questions around that? Yes.
Do you find a lot of the customers go to the AWS or commercial clouds first, and then they, you know, experience the costs and everything, and then look at trying to develop in-house? Is that the normal way that they get introduced to the local cloud?
That's an excellent question.
So the question was?
Yes. So do we find that people go to the large-scale public cloud providers like AWS first, then find out how expensive it is, and move to using something like OpenStack? Let's put that to the panel.
Well, yeah, look, absolutely, and you know, there's lots of research done on how IT is being acquired these days, right? And from Gartner and Forrester and all those kinds of analysts. And one of the things that we see frequently is that a lot of the IT decision making is moving out of the IT organization and into the lines of business. And so they follow the path of least resistance. So lines of business they want access to resources, and so the first thing they do is they can go to a public cloud provider with a credit card and start getting a project up and rolling. That's great to start something up quickly, but you know, then the question is, well, what's the management of that, and what happens when that particular executive leaves with his credit card and he's no longer part of the organisation, and you've got a production system running, you know, without sort of any kind of oversight, and that's where internal IT organisations are looking to provide, like I said before, they're looking to provide the same kind of experience to their end customers, but you know, it's not necessarily going to be the economic way to do it in the public cloud environment, and so that's why they're looking for alternatives so they can do both. I mean, everyone's doing both. Hybrid cloud is the thing, right?
Yeah. I can certainly attest to that at Telstra. So from an Amazon perspective, as part of our intercloud solution, we on-sell that, as, you know, whether it's Azure or Amazon. But we also internally consume it, not as an alternative, you know, as a replacement to our internal clouds, but just as a complement. You know, it complements what we already have today. And there are some business units who prefer to use AWS for X number of reasons. But so we don't see it as a competitor necessarily, as just as complementary.
And we've certainly seen a number of researchers who've gone out, and they still do go out and use Amazon themselves off their own bat just to do certain things. But we have had people then come to us and say, well, now we're ramping up what we want to do. It's getting expensive. And, you know, you're providing a research cloud for researchers. But, you know, the Amazon effect, in some sense, it's good in that you talk to people about cloud and they often get it. They've used Amazon, they know about Amazon or whatever. But the downside is they just assume, therefore, it's better, cheaper, whatever than what you know, why are you doing Amazon? Sorry, why are you doing OpenStack yourself? It's like the Adobe guys said this morning, trying to convince your boss when everyone seems to be moving out to the public cloud that no, we should be moving back in and running your own cloud. It can be challenging.
So are there differences in terms of the difficulty of integration for companies sticking a toe in the water with cloud technology with the likes of AWS compared to OpenStack? Does OpenStack require much higher development skills, familiarity with you know, Linux and so on, and the ability to work with more or less mature components of OpenStack? Whereas, yeah, sorry, go ahead, Roland.
I don't think it does, but we have the problem where a number of people, you know, IT departments at universities or companies or whatever, you know, they're familiar with VMware, they're familiar with Amazon, maybe not so much with OpenStack. So they're interested in it, but getting that training or the people understanding how to use it is an issue.
And it also depends how you consume it. I mean, there are a wide variety of consumption models available from OpenStack. They've certainly changed a lot since the early days. So there are now a number of different ways to consume private cloud OpenStack that may or may not require you to develop a lot of skills yourself.
Right.
I think from a technical difficulty perspective, it's not significantly different, but they are different. There are different integrations that need to happen.
Yes.
And you've also got sort of the ecosystem situation as well. That there are some offerings. Well, when you go into AWS, you get a whole bunch of stuff kindly provided and locking you in nicely. But they aren't necessarily always going to be available from an OpenStack perspective, and perhaps you have to do some of that integration yourself.
Yes. Yeah, that's what I was thinking, and I guess a factor is also sort of the availability of skills. But I guess being open, you're not sort of locked into a solution from a single provider. You can use OpenStack. There are many different OpenStack distros, so that's sort of a factor in favor of the OpenStack side as well. So moving on to a different subject, but nonetheless topical.
We do have a question he's been desperately trying to ask.
Oh yes, sorry, my apologies. Yes, sir. What's your question?
Does this also extend to APIs, as far as AWS APIs versus OpenStack APIs, requirements from the users for the interoperability that is demanded by the people who are actually writing applications?
Good question.
Okay, I'm not sure if I can paraphrase that, but
So the question was about APIs.
yeah. So how do OpenStack APIs compare to AWS APIs from a usability point of view?
So I mean, you know, the obvious first step is that a lot of the APIs that are present in Amazon are things that have been targeted by the OpenStack community anyway, right? So there's no point in sort of swimming against the tide from that point of view. A clear example, things like S3. S3 is now a de facto standard for accessing object storage, right? So there's a need to make it as interoperable as possible. But then to give you a choice to do other things as well if necessary, and that's where the community effect and the open source effect can provide those interfaces perhaps a lot more rapidly.
Okay, so before we move on to the next topic, does anyone have any other questions around the Amazon effect on open source cloud business models? All right, so the next topic that we've got is quite a hot button topic at the moment, OpenStack and the edge. How much hype and how much substance? So let's start with you, Roland Chan.
I think it's got a fair bit of both, which is kind of normal, I suppose, for OpenStack.
Hype and substance at the same time.
Yeah, well, I mean...
Substantial hype.
Well, substantial amounts of hype, no. The edge computing use case is very real. The demand for it, the need for it is very real. Is it a well understood market? You know, probably not. And certainly there's a lot of hype going around about, well, the usual things, who might be best to solve those problems. Yeah, sorry, I've lost my train of thought.
Yeah, no. So yeah, how much hype and how much substance in terms of edge use of OpenStack? I guess.
So,
yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, it's very real. In telcos, NFV is a thing. It's not going away. It's happening at a great rate. And you know, to the extent that continues, there needs to be a solution for computing at the edge. So that in that sense, it's very real and not just hype. But having said that, there is an enormous amount of hype, and perhaps the solutions that are being hyped are not as mature as they might be being presented as. So
anyone else on the panel got some thoughts on the edge use case for OpenStack?
Yeah, look, generically the use case from Telstra perspective is very real. So, you know, on a number of fronts. Obviously, you know, we look at things like 5G. We've got some of our wireless guys here in the conference where for some of the X2 interfaces that require very low latency. So the ability to be able to have service edges closer to the subscribers is a real use case for us. We're also trying to productize, you know, other IoT type of capabilities so we can on-sell that to utilities and other companies. And there's a need for us to have that ability to, again, to spin up any type of services closer to, so the use case from a service provider perspective is definitely real. In addition, obviously, you know, that's one of our differentiator from Telstra perspective. We own all these exchanges, thousands of them, closer to the subscribers, unlike an Amazon or a Microsoft. So our ability to be able to provide a higher quality of service closer to the users is something that we would like to, from a Telstra perspective, leverage more. So.
Yeah, to my mind, edge in general implies high scale replication. So you're doing the same thing over and over again, and services that you want to automate really, and all of those are really use cases individually, which are satisfied by OpenStack as one of the solutions.
So I guess an interesting question from my point of view is where do you actually draw the edge in a telco network? So it's on
the edge.
Yes. So is it I guess David, you'd probably be in a good position to comment on this. Is it well understood in telco land where the edge of the network lies?
Well, we try not to actually define it. It's
Right,
basically,
yeah.
it's based on particular, topology, where if you need to push the services out to provide a better service, then you push it out as far as you need to go.
Correct.
So we're not trying to say, here's where the edge is. It depends on the business case, the need, and you'll go out as far as you can.
So I guess the question in the limit is, are you potentially going to have OpenStack one day running on devices at retail customer sites, for example, like running, an NBN modem or something, or is that too extreme to justify having an OpenStack instance?
Well, we'll have to be a lot simpler to manage than it is now. But I doubt very much whether we're going to go to in the individual customer premises, but we might go one hop just high on the edges of Telstra essentially, where we aggregate multiple tenants.
Right.
But not on individual tenant CPU devices.
Well,
Not in the short term.
having said that, phones now have 8 gigs of RAM or 8 cores and 32 gigs of RAM. They're huge. So, I mean, give it a few years, and the CPE device might be rather impressive from a compute perspective.
So in the National Research Cloud, we've been having these discussions around, do we want to aggregate to a smaller number of, so we distribute across 7 or 8 nodes across the country, and we have been expanding to a couple more recently. Do we want to aggregate to a smaller number of nodes where there's maybe economies of scale or something, or do we want to be able to push out to more? Because there is a good use case, as you said, for locality of data. There was an example this morning about new imaging machines pushing out enormous amounts of data. You'd want to be able to store those locally, ideally, not have to ship them back and forth across the network to storage and then access them on the cloud, maybe access them on researchers' local desktops, on their local HPC systems. So there's a good argument for locality of data coming off scientific instruments or things like that, where you might have individual universities, research institutions, even research groups having their own local cloud nodes, for example. And that's, I see that would be perfectly reasonable as an edge use case, as long as the automation around it, it's easy to do.
And I think the complexity of management is also being addressed. I mean, we have a partner who actually bundles our OpenStack inside their own little appliance. Mm-hmm. So, a three rack unit box, and you've got an OpenStack environment. So, and it's literally turnkey for them with a nice front end and so on and so forth. So it is being addressed. I think it's just a matter of finding the right use case.
How mature is the market for OpenStack appliances?
Good question, right? Was that a question you'd ever written down? Or? We didn't plan this, right?
I mean, I thought to some extent we went through that already, and they're all dead. But I think that was probably just trying to take an enterprise business model and wrap OpenStack up inside it. Potentially, I guess there might be new use cases that where an appliance might be appropriate, but I think it's difficult to say because we have been there and done that, and they all got shut down and acquired. So I guess we'll see what the next generation looks like.
Well, where we're seeing an appliance model being adopted is where you have a hybrid environment. So it's not just OpenStack, but other things as well, and that seems to be quite attractive to a lot of people.
Yeah, so I guess the question that was going through my mind was when we talk about the edge today, what does OpenStack at the edge look like? Does it usually, do we think that it will usually look like an appliance type model, or are we actually going to be building pods all the way out to the edge with numbers of racked units?
Possible. I mean, I don't know. Both.
Yeah. Well, this is coming back to the question around the hype and the substance. I mean, so it's a theoretical solution to some use cases that may materialize.
Well, it's not just theoretical. I mean, people, as Peter says, people are deploying very small OpenStacks out there, and I think it was Verizon, who have a tiny little OpenStack they put in cafes or something. So I mean, there are real use cases out there, but I don't think you're going to find there's a single solution. If you want to put an OpenStack right at the edge of one of David's radio access networks, then it's probably going to be an appliance. Yeah. But if it's going to go in an exchange, maybe it's going to look more like a traditional, compute solution. All
right. So throwing the question open to the floor, hype versus substance for OpenStack at the edge. Any comments or questions from any of you guys in the audience?
From a developer perspective, it's all hype at this point. There's no explanation of like what we should be working on at all, as far as like what the hell the edge is and what do we need to do within Nova, for example, for the edge.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely what we've seen. So from the OpenStack developer community perspective, yeah, it's not even really a well-developed set of use cases, much less anything that could actually be worked on. But if you want to drop by our booth, Michael, talk to Michael Still. I think he's brilliant. Problem solved.
So just for fun, let's just do a quick show of hands. Who thinks edge is more hype than substance? 2, 3, 4, 5. And who thinks it's more substance than hype?
Oh, we got one.
So out of a response rate of about 20%
Yeah,
of the
a lot of people
audience.
with no hands.
Yeah.
But in Australia, there's like, what, 2 or 3 customers with the reach for Edge. So like, it's real, but it's real for a very small number of users.
Yes.
That's probably, yeah. It's real, but for a small number of users is what, to amplify what he just said.
All right.
Yeah.
Very good. Okay, so moving on to our next subject, the biggest challenges facing the OpenStack community today, and let's start with yourself, Paul Coddington.
So I think, one of the problems is OpenStack, as we saw at the keynotes this morning, OpenStack has grown enormously in the last few years from a very sort of small core component to a huge ecosystem of many different products and services and components that you can bolt together. So the complexity and how to deal with that, how to, the integration challenge, how to manage and deploy things easily. I mean, that's a big challenge for us, and I imagine in general. And the other challenges I see is the ones we've kind of already mentioned, which is, the default people say is, let's just move everything to the public cloud. Why are you bothering to do it yourself? And getting over that mindset is sometimes challenging.
So anyone else on the panel got any thoughts? What are the biggest challenges? Sort of OpenStack is 6 years old. What are the biggest challenges, Roland, in your mind, currently facing the community?
I don't know if it's necessarily the biggest challenge for the community, but it's the biggest challenge that sort of sits in my mind. And that is one of focus. I think since I've been involved with OpenStack for a few years, I think perhaps my perception is that things have gotten a little bit more focused, perhaps. But I think it's still not. There still, in my mind, seem to be some use cases that people are looking at that selfishly I think are kind of a waste of time. So I'm not sure. I don't have a crystal ball that says OpenStack should be expanding out to cover a really huge number of use cases. I think it's more likely to develop in the other direction and to be, I guess, more of a component of a set of solutions that address a somewhat more narrow set of use cases. And I'm not sure that, assuming I'm right, which I obviously could well not be, continuing to maintain a sort of a broad focus is potentially a bit of an issue.
Very good. Anyone else in the panel got any thoughts on challenges? Peter Lees, yourself?
Yeah, so I'm talking from a distribution vendor point of view. What we're seeing is OpenStack is moving from the early adopter phase into the early majority phase in terms of the type of customers that we're seeing that want to implement this. And these new set of customers are not the classical IT adoption kind of organizations. They're the traditional organizations that want to see things happening in an enterprise grade way. So the challenge for them is to understand what the dynamics of an open source model is and how that affects the way that they acquire the product. But then the challenge for the community is also matching the expectations of that particular group with the things that they like working on. You know, often there's a bit of an imbalance between things that are fun to develop and things that people actually want to use in an enterprise environment, right? So balancing that is a bit of a challenge, and I guess that's where we come in to some extent. And then also the other sort of twist to that is, you know, we still like having new features or changes to the ways that things operate and so on, but there's a requirement for stability, for example. So, you know, we're talking to someone right now, and they're looking for a 5-year lifespan on a particular product set that's available now, right? Which is, in the context of OpenStack, that's like okay, we can kind of do something for you there, but it really, it goes back to, you know, that misunderstanding about how the software is developed and the way that it works. We can give them a 5-year lifespan, but it doesn't mean it's going to be exactly the same for that 5 years, right? So that's the challenge. I think the difference between the new larger set of customers for this type of technology and the way that the community is developing like that. And so that's what we struggle with pretty much on a daily basis as a distribution.
Yeah, very good.
And I would concur with that for somewhere like a Telstra, that expectation or the gap between how we're used to consuming software and the lack of understanding of what it means to you know, essentially consume open source software. So we're used to managing risk through some sort of a contract with an external vendor. So when you're insourcing some of that risk, the organisation may not necessarily be ready to be able to do that. And when you're doing, and they don't quite have a good handle, you know, we don't have a good handle of what it takes to be able to own and manage and life cycle manage an open source software. In terms of the manpower required, in terms of the OpEx cost required. So, so that from a consumer of it is we see as one of the bigger problems and issues just internally.
Yep.
So throwing it open to the floor, do we have any thoughts from the audience around the biggest challenges currently facing the OpenStack community? Anything from anyone wearing a developer hat? My friend there in the red t-shirt, you probably have some thoughts to share.
Biggest challenges. Yeah, I mean, everybody wants what they want, and they want it immediately, and they don't want to devote full-time development resources. Like they'll have their internal development teams push a bunch of code and say, like, here it is, you know, you're welcome. But it doesn't fit with like everything else that we are planning on doing, or it's from people that I've never talked to, so I don't necessarily just trust their code right away. It derails everything else we're doing if we have to just spend all our time doing this new thing. Priorities. I mean, we had several summits and sessions where we talk about the bottom work group or enterprise smorgasbord or something. You know, we say distill this into like 1 or 2 things, not 50 things, and then have one person that's actually a project manager that can like figure out who in the community is going to drive this thing, and that doesn't really happen. So, especially if it's a major like multi-project effort.
So yes, go ahead.
I was going to try and summarize for that. So
yes.
for the audio. So the challenge is consolidating all of the different requests that are coming in from multiple different directions, or possibly code drops that are coming from multiple directions into a single project, and the fact that you actually have to spend more time just reviewing all the different things and rather than, you know, working on the idea properly, and the fact that you have these potentially conflicting requirements coming from different groups, and it's difficult to appropriately allocate your time and your effort. Is that a fair summary? Right.
So over the 6 years, has OpenStack developed a clear vision of what it wants to be? So this is what we want to do, and this is what we don't want to do?
There is a mission statement. It's got the word ubiquitous in it.
Ubiquitous?
Yeah. So to my mind...
So we want to be all things to all people?
But that's pretty much what
yeah.
wants to be everywhere, right?
All right. Okay, that's probably...
there's a comment here.
Possibly a challenge.
Thanks.
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay, so just a question. Over the last 12 months, we've seen a couple of big names pull out of OpenStack. Where do you, as people in the industry, see the curve at? Are there still increasing number of customers? Are we flattened a bit? Are we starting to decrease? Where are we on the actual business adoption, customer demand curve, do you think?
I think here in Australia we're still going up, but it's certainly been the case that the Australian market's been behind, I guess, the more developed technology markets for a while now. So I guess, yeah, I mean, that's where it is for Australia. I can't speak with much accuracy for what's happening globally, but it wouldn't surprise me to see a bit more consolidation. On the vendor side, there isn't an enormous amount of, differentiation, I think. And so from the perspective of people who are providing private cloud type products and services, yeah, I would expect to see a couple more names disappear maybe.
So just to clarify, so you were asking about players sort of moving out of OpenStack. Are you talking about vendors doing this?
Oh, just generally, where do you like?
Vendors or customers or people using it? Are we shifting from early adopters to more? So, and I think that's the issue, right? So there are two aspects to this, right? One is, as I said before, I think we're moving from the early adoption phase into the early majority phase, which is where it becomes more mainline, becomes more mainstream. The whole concept of cloud, not only for external but for internal, is fairly well established now. And so that then leads to a consolidation in the market of the people who are providing those products and services, right? So we saw pretty much the same thing happen in Linux, right? Back in the early 2000s, every man and his dog had a Linux distribution, and there was a Linux a person responsible for Linux in every major organization. I mean, Morgan Stanley had a vice president of Linux kernel engineering, which, I don't know, Morgan Stanley probably shouldn't have had that kind of guy, right? They don't now, right? Because it's consolidated down into, 2 or 3 standard distributions, and people go to that. And I expect to see a very similar kind of thing happening in the OpenStack world. I mean, our specific example at the beginning of this year, pretty much all of the HPE OpenStack developers moved to SUSE. They didn't disappear, they moved to SUSE, and that was a clear business decision taken by both SUSE and HPE, because HPE still wants to do OpenStack, and they still have the Helion OpenStack products and so on. But rather than doing it all themselves, they've come to SUSE and said, well, okay, we'll use your product as the basis for the higher order product that we then give to our end customers. And that just makes sense, applying the expertise in the right place at the right time.
So is there data there on the size of the Australian market?
I don't know, that might be a question for Roland.
Not a lot. So my view of that is that there's a very small amount of information that comes out of the OpenStack user survey. I mean, it's always a small sample size of the total market, and given the size of the Australian market generally, I don't know how reliable that data would be. I'm sure there are analysts who would be able to provide opinions. Whether or not they share their data is another question. So I don't know that there's much reliable data on the Australian market at all. Not that you'd find it public.
Does that address your questions? Very good. Gentleman in the middle.
I had an organisation we're associated with wanted to put in an OpenStack product. So first thing they did was get their technicians to run up a simple OpenStack product, but then their management said, well, you ought to get the real skills in, you want to get any bigger. So they advertised for some technical skills and couldn't get it. So do you see it as a bit of a challenge still for organisations to get the right technical skills to be able to build and manage an OpenStack product? Is that a challenge in Australia?
Sort of. It depends on your strategy for acquiring those skills. It's not, certainly in Australia, it's not possible to just put an ad out and do it using the sort of traditional hiring mechanism. I think you've got to invest in building the capability internally. I don't think there are enough people out there at the moment. It's not that kind of market. So you can hire some people. That's great. You can hire some sort of cloudy people, which is great too. But you will need to train them, basically.
Yeah, that's what we've had to do.
So I think just to add to that, one thing that we've seen is the use of partnering models for this, where you might engage a services partner to begin with to do some work for you while you get your own guys up to speed, and then take the capability in-house. I think that's a model that we've seen a little bit of.
And I don't think there's anywhere in the world where you can just put an ad in the paper and say we want an OpenStack guy, and then 5 people turn up to apply. So I mean, I know we internally when we're recruiting OpenStack developers, our jobs are available worldwide, and a lot of our development work is distributed. So you could literally work in, I don't know, Sydney or Hobart, and work on OpenStack for us. But even then, it's a challenge getting people of the right caliber, but then people at all. We're not overwhelmed with development applications from genuine candidates. We have quite a lot from non-genuine candidates, but we don't have them from genuine candidates.
Does that address your question?
So the short version of that is make sure if you do have an OpenStack guy that you pay him well.
Okay, so sorry, another question. Yes, please.
This is actually harking back about 20 minutes or so to the height versus substance question.
Yep.
Regarding edge computing, and given the theoretical benefits of edge computing and so forth, and the probably accurate comment that came from the audience of that it seemed like height in some ways, but there are certainly Telstra, for example, easily imagine use cases for them. So the gap between that ideal and the real world, what are the challenges in that middle space? Is it management, implementation, hardware, network speed? And I'm sure as vendors and users and researchers, you might all have a different view on that.
Do you want to repeat the question? Were you listening?
I couldn't. I tried.
What?
Yeah.
What are the benefits from the point of view of all the panelists? What is the gap? What is the gap between the theoretical benefit and the practical application today? What do we need to fill in through the middle? And since I'm talking, I'll continue, which is I think actually the specification of what it is we're trying to achieve. There are lots of different use cases for this, and also lots of definitions of what edge means. So I think there's not one answer of we're missing this and then we can do edge with OpenStack. It's for this case, edge means this, and so this is the thing we need to be able to do. And then for this other case, edge means this, and so on, right? So I think that's probably more of the missing gap. Certainly from a vendor's point of view, if we get the request, we need to do edge computing, we want to do OpenStack, then we will have to follow up with, well, what do you actually mean by that? What do you want to achieve? Blah, 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 before we can put together a solution. So I don't know, from a consumer's point of view.
From a consumer point of view, I guess, as you said, we need to define it first. So what does it look like? We're trying to define it, what is its characteristics of it, whether it's from an operational point of view, whether it's from a capability point of view. But we're also trying to define when do we go there? When's the case for you to go out and distribute and put a set of infrastructure out there? When is it a case to pull it back? How much does it cost you? How can you assure it? How can you life cycle or how can you manage it? So those are the sort of things we're going through at the moment, and they're just trying to kind of identify when do you have a business case to distribute, and if you do, what does that look like, and what sort of workloads are suitable for, and so from a Telstra point of view or an enterprise point of view, that's those are the things we're focusing on at the moment before we make a decision on yes, we're going to put something out at some distributor site.
All right, so guys, we've reached the end of our time slot. So thank you very much to the panelists. Great work, guys. You did a great job. Thank you. Does anyone have any final questions before we finish up? Yes, gentleman in the middle.
Over the past year, what have you seen in a change in OpenStack that has been really great and good for business, community, tech, whatever?
So what have we seen in the last year that's been good? Like I said, before, the shift from the early adopters to the early majority, that opening up of the mainstream, we're not having to spend so much time talking about what cloud is and why cloud is good anymore. It's just, okay, let's go into the next phase of the discussion. And for me, that means it's a wider spread adoption. You're not having to sell the idea anymore, which is good.
All right, well, yes, again, gentleman in the middle.
Australia versus the rest of the world was the topic.
Yes, how OpenStack compares down under.
How do you feel we've adopted OpenStack different in Australia to what the rest of the world, in particular the different sectors of, community, public?
That's an excellent question.
Or industrial, I don't know how we've done it different in Australia. Have you got any ideas?
I think the big differences come down to the size of the enterprises here. It's what you might class a medium-sized enterprise in the US is significantly larger than a medium-sized enterprise in Australia, and therefore they'll have a larger internal technical capability and probably be more able to deal with cloudy stuff like OpenStack. And I think that's driven, that's part of the reason that OpenStack adoption in Australia is less. There isn't, you need a certain amount of momentum, or not momentum, you need a certain amount of force to be able to give your organisation the momentum to deploy OpenStack. And that's just not available for as many people in a small market.
Yeah, and I think enough scale to make it worthwhile as well. And again, that's, as you say, the scale here is less than it is overseas.
Any final questions? Okay, well, thanks everyone for your time, and please join me in giving a big round of applause to the panelists.